Welcome. I'm Liz Taylor, ocean explorer, naturalist, and entrepreneur.
I'm Sylvia Earle, oceanographer, explorer, founder of Mission Blue, National Geographic explorer, and I'm an ocean elder. Thank you, ocean elders, for making this webinar possible.
Absolutely. And this is our show, Dive In, where we host informal and open conversations with the ocean community. Today, we're mostly going to be focusing on answering questions from our last webinar, but you can ask new questions by putting them into the Q&A box, and we'll get through as many today as we can. We are following up on the Titan disaster today, and we're being joined again by subsea engineer Tony Lawson. Thank you so much, Tony, for being here with us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah,
there were so many questions, and we did not have time in our one
hour
to begin to respond. And Tony, your expertise and experience, and I have to say wisdom about what it takes to get out there, down there, and come back from the deep is really a special opportunity to air the issues and really, I think, build confidence that we need to go and we can go, must go safely and explore the ocean. We invest so much in going in the other direction, high in the sky, and we're neglecting this part of the universe. We really are handicapped by not understanding the nature of the ocean. And so pleased that you are among those who are pushing the edge to change that, to gain safe and workable access.
reliable.
Reliable, yeah, rugged and reliable.
Yeah.
Onward and downward.
So a lot of the questions that we had were really around the choice of the materials. And I know you did a really great detailed answer to one of the questions that came through that Gigi shared in the link to the webinar, which was awesome. But really, I guess some of the people are asking about what part failed first. Was it the carbon fiber? Was it potentially the port? Or did the titanium end cap somehow just, come apart? And the brutality of metal versus carbon, particularly in the cold climate of the deep sea. Do you have any further thoughts about the materials that you wanted to share with people today?
Yeah, sure. My first instinct, I see some questions. Did the titanium hand caps blow off? Decidedly no. They're held on with about 11 million pounds with the pressure at that depth. They'd gone down and cycled multiple times. The nice thing about metallics is they're really not going to even be in a fatigue cycle at that point. So once they're proven, they're proven. You know that they're going to work for you and they're not going to surprise you. Acrylic and carbon fiber polymers are subject to creep and long-term, it was more like a short-term fatigue that can happen unless they're designed very carefully to avoid that. So my initial feeling, and we've been hearing certain things, that there had been another hull already built and it had started to delaminate, and they built a new hull. You start, kind of putting the pieces together, and it was, to me, most likely the carbon fiber hull. There are a couple other small things that may have happened. The acrylic, even if they were pushing its design, it had gone to depth, it had been tested. It may have had a creep failure, critical pressure failure. But again, I feel like it's kind of proven itself no matter what they had done. So really, I kind of lean very heavily in the camp that it was a carbon fiber failure.
Right. And it's true too that you see sometimes sympathetic failures, right, in materials or different other housings in the area can light things off.
There is that. There were on board a pair of what they call they're glass housings that are used primarily in the ocean scientific research side, where they use them for buoyancy and for electronics housings, and they're two glass hemispheres that are put together. They're fairly reliable, but they are known for imploding. once in a while, randomly. They're not put together just right. A little bit of something gets on there. Glass, this is where we know glass can be kind of, we call it unpredictable, but it's somewhat predictable in the sense that usually there's something done poorly with them. It carried two of these housings, and they were right up adjacent to the rear titanium pressure hulls, so the end caps in the back. And the pictures I saw in the record coverage, their protective housings were there, but the glass was not. So whether they went first or as a sympathetic failure later, we may never know. But even carrying those things on the submersible to me was very disheartening to see.
Right. I know that when we've worked in the past with the Pisces subs or other deep vehicles, that even with an ROV, we don't really want to get around those oceanographic spheres, because I mean, like you say, they can be used over and over and over again. But if the hemispheres are not put together just in a particular way, even a human hair in between them can create some real angst and cause a failure, despite the fact that we know glass is very strong in a spherical configuration. So one of the other questions we had was, we just talked about given the corrosive nature of seawater and the pressures exerted on submersibles, what does a normal lifetime of a submersible look like? And when should a submersible be taken out of service?
Well, the beauty of class, when you're in class, you're inspected yearly. They look for corrosion. The acrylics have a very specific life cycle in the rules. Usually 20 years, 10 years, depending on the depth and pressure, limited number of cycles, I believe 10,000 normally. So acrylic has very much a inspected, registered, they log your dives, you know what you've done, and at the end of life, you replace them. There's a couple of older acrylic hull subs out there have had replacement hulls made. That's the nice thing about class. And as for metal and the metallics, well, titanium, very low corrosion issues. The steel, more aging metal hulls are inspected and protected against corrosion with zincs and coatings and everything else, and regularly inspected. So the lifetime of those are for practical human purposes, unlimited, so long as they're properly maintained, and who's checking on that maintenance. So it all depends, and class helps you stay between the lines.
Yeah, and I think we've seen one of Stockton Rush's criticisms of class is that it somehow stopped innovation from happening, constrained it. And I think that's got to be one of the biggest fallacies of this whole thing, because we've seen so much innovation and progress in submersible design over the last 50 years. I don't think it's just been stagnant. We've seen a lot of different new materials, new control systems, new battery chemistries, but to your point, always coming online through the rigor of testing and eventual classification before they're ever used in the practical application.
So the Johnson Sea Lynx, the two subs that were operated by Harbor Branch, were launched in 1968 and 1970, and they were classed. They did go through inspections. They did have to replace the acrylic hulls. They were only taken out of service relatively recently, and they could have continued had there been the will to bring them up to speed. But again, I think about the Alvin. The original Alvin was launched in 1964, and while that sub by the same name has gone through many refits, including entirely new pressure hull, and most recently to be able to go a titanium sphere to go to 6,000 meters. It's not exactly the same sub that started out in 1964, but it's the same name and the same basic design. So to the question about how long can a sub live, it depends on how you take care of it. Longer than most cars.
That's true. It is, they are typically durable goods. And so this next question comes on. Do you think the industry safety standards are going to be altered in any way because of this event? Or are they already strong enough and it's just that OceanGate didn't want to follow them? Yeah, I think that is
Yeah.
kind of the case.
Yeah, they're pretty much self-answered there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have been speaking with the classing agencies. Everyone feels that we've been doing a good job.
Yeah.
50 years is a good track record. But unfortunately, we can't make people do class, especially on the high seas. The question I get a lot is about that. Can't someone to stop them? It's like, unfortunately, no, it's the high seas. Who's going to regulate that? And who's going to agree to that regulation? China, Russia, the United States, they're not ever going to agree to who has the right to stop somebody from doing something on the high seas outside of territorial economic waters.
Right. And I think that's
just the world we live in.
Yeah. And I think it's really worth mentioning that, despite all the sort of concern and, angst that people had over seeing this operation coming online, that there was also a lot of effort to skirt and evade rules that might have stopped, like, never touching U.S. waters, because our U.S. Coast Guard would have said, not today, not any day are you going to dive that thing here. So we went to the Bahamas, we went to Canada, we went to, and then again, looking for ways to get around the rules or to evade them in some way. And I think that's a really important part to understand, that there are ways and means to control these operations and to oversee them that exist, and they've been working very successfully for a long time. But you do get people that specifically work to find a workaround, and it becomes harder to control it.
So one of the questions that came in was, so you'd like to dive in a submarine, what questions would you ask of the operator to assure yourself that this, that it's going to be safe?
Is it classed?
Is it classed? Yes. And I will tell you, there have been many times where this here has been, offered to go on a trip, and I'll say, is it classed? And I'll go, sure, it's classed. And I'm like, send me the documentation. I want to see, I want to see it. I want to see the certification. I want to see that it's not sort of like been sort of carried over, or it's coming lapsed up soon, or it's lapsed. I want to see
tense. Yeah.
tense. I want to see that certification stamped, dated.
Is your driver's license current?
Yeah, well, I've got one, but it expired a couple months ago. No, that's not how it works.
Is the pilot of your airplane, is he a certified pilot?
Yeah.
You kick the tires of your car before you get in.
But yeah, it is a good point that, there's fairly straightforward due diligence that can be done. It is perplexing why it didn't happen in this case, but I think it's, again, people do kind of put their trust in an operation. They'll, especially if they're, paying a lot of money, and they have some level of assurance that they feel like it's going to be okay.
And the Titan had dived in the same location before. That suggests that it was
kind of okay.
They weren't the first, but because of the cycling issues that you mentioned, Tony, that there's a point that you need to be aware that recurrent testing, and knowing the nature of the materials, and having somebody else look over your shoulder and verify that you got the right judgment on this. Anyway, it's a tragedy that we seriously hope won't happen in the future.
Yeah, well, I think there have been a lot of lessons learned, and it was such a high profile disaster that I think people will kind of do a better job of seeking out information. I mean, we do get phone calls. People want to go on a trip, and they'll call up and say, would Sylvia dive this sub? And they'll get a yes or no. And again, ask for the documentation, make sure it's up to date. So this is an interesting one. It was mentioned the submersible was tubular instead of spherical, making it susceptible to implosion. Am I wrong in thinking submarines are tubular? So what is the difference? You know, you get a Navy submarine, right? They're all tubular, but how is it different when you're going deeper?
Yeah, naval submarines are long and tubular. Titan was definitely a tubular design. There are tubular submersibles. The stresses are a little different. A sphere experiences nothing but hoop stress. The stresses are all compressive all through the skin from the hydrostatic external pressure. A tube gets a little different because you've got these end caps and they're squeezing on the end and they're putting a compressive stress, axial compressive stress down the length of the tube. There's a hoop stress running circumferentially. Those stresses have to be looked at in combination, and they form an angle. On top of that, once you get into a region about past 2 times the tube's diameter, length, buckling becomes the primary mode of failure of a cylinder. But there are formulas to deal with that, to add thickness or add stiffening ribs around the perimeter to prevent that wall from crinkling and forming that bow action that you see. You crush a can or pop, it does a bunch of little buckling failures. That's what the crushing of a can is. It's a buckling failure mode. If you put little ridges around here, little supporting rims all the way along, it wouldn't do that as easily. So there are ways to use cylinders and to thicken them to eliminate the buckling stress problem and to constrain the forces, and all has to be done carefully in the calculations. It's not as efficient a shape. It's going to be heavier per unit volume that you're trying to create inside. That's the difference. So
That's good. That's good for people to understand that, because, you know, virtually every submersible, and especially deep water submersibles, they do rely on that spherical configuration of the pressure hull. And, you know, we had a question that came in about the deep search research and development project that we undertook. And we looked at all the different shapes, and you ran so many different models and looked at all the different stressors. And the nice thing is that we do have that, you know, computer technology and the modeling technology today to really be able to evaluate very predictably what will happen with different form factors and sizes of ports and different materials. So that's all very possible to do. We don't just have to kind of go out there and, you know, huck something over the side and see if it survives. we can do a lot of the modeling ahead of time. And we have, you know, there are some pressure chambers as well. You know, as part of that study too, is identifying where are all the pressure testing facilities and the different sizes of spheres and configuration of spheres or potential pressure hulls that they can accommodate for that kind of destructive testing. And then, you know, to see where we go from there.
Superficially, the design for deep search appeared to be a cylinder, but in fact, the critical part where people were sitting was a sphere, and the shape, long and slim, was more for movement through the water more efficiently, like a fish. Those fish tend to be long and slim, and but the sphere was what was really intended to be able to withstand deep pressure. And Tony, most of the military subs don't go very deep. I mean,
yeah, that's true.
They don't go as deep as the.
No, they don't. But stresses in engineering, it's a matter of scale. The deeper you go, the thicker and heavier you'll get. So the technology they use on a submarine for the military to make the hull strong enough for the depth is very much scalable, especially with metallics, to go deeper and deeper and deeper. Just get thicker and thicker and heavier and heavier. But yeah, I mean, a submarine designed to go to 4,000 meters would be absolutely massive. I don't even know how you would float it, because it's at that point the internal volume of that air is not going to float in the middle. It's going to be heavy and it's going to have to sink. So you're going to have to add a whopping amount of buoyancy. It's impacting to get it to float. But carbon fiber is another beast. It has not been studied enough to be completely safe. It was, so, Oak Ridge did a lot of studies on carbon fiber in the 80s.
Right.
Stockton Rush was saying, oh, we got to test things and break things. That's how we learn things. They actually did that. They did that with carbon fiber. Stashew did it at Oak Ridge in the 80s. And they came back saying, not good, more study required, a lot more study.
Well, they weren't sending humans down either. They were using AUVs for
Yeah.
instrument housing and sensor for other sensors, but they not only use carbon fiber but glass fiber.
Yep.
And they tested, examined the failure points, tested to failure, and I think made good use of the fiber approach, but that has not been widely incorporated into submersible designs, and probably for really good reasons. And I have to say that for most instruments, or many instruments, and for military subs, having the ability to see from the inside out is not the priority. Putting instruments like sonars that see with sound, it used to baffle me why, it still does, military subs really avoid having ports. They have a conning tower where you can put up a periscope when you get back to the surface, but underwater, their job is not to look at wildlife in the ocean. They have other interests, and it's so it's like being in a closed room the whole time that you're down there.
Yeah. So I had another question. Someone was asking about the additive material fatigue due to transportation of the submersible and how could that be calculated? There was speculation that the Titan was actually towed out to the dive site on more than one occasion rather than just being carried on the deck of the vessel. So can a long tow like that create additional stressors on materials? And is there any way to calculate that?
Again, when we look at a class submersible, everything I've seen of the Titan, and even on this mission that failed, it was towed, but it was towed on a dry platform. It was not towed in water on site, and that platform itself could actually submerge, and that's how they launch it. So it wasn't being launched from the deck of a ship. It was being towed on a barge platform. That barge platform was submersible. But while it was being towed, it was sitting up high and dry, and it wasn't the primary tow point. In class design, we do have to account for stresses on the hull and attachments. There's guidelines and forces that we have to accommodate and account for. And they're pretty excessive and can actually add quite a bit of structure and weight to a submersible design. Again, Titan working outside the class, we don't know what they did to account for those stresses. Personally, I when you look at a hull that is so strong that it has to resist the stresses of that depth, and it did for a short period of time in dives, it did actually survive. The strength that is required for that usually makes the stresses you're going to have during towing insignificant. Because again, when you're looking at things like 11 million pounds on that end dome, you're looking at stresses inside the material at depth over 17,000 psi. Probably towing forces are going to be magnitude or magnitudes of order less than that. So they don't even start to register on the overall strength of the hull and the submersible. And even auxiliary systems may be affected.
Yeah.
And that could be a problem.
In some of the, some submersible designs, class designs, you do kind of look at towing as kind of a one recovery method, right? But I mean, I've seen you sit down and look at like, well, if we had to like recover the sub and the crane on the ship broke or something, how would we tow it? And, what does that towing bridle look like? And, there's a lot that goes into figuring out like, how would you carry out a tow so that it would be, A, comfortable for anybody that was inside, and B, not damage the vehicle.
Yeah. And the classing rules cover that. They tell you how strong they have to be, and that's based on years and years and years of experience.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't work. Okay, let's change the rules a little bit. Okay, that's held pretty good for 50 years. All right. So
Exactly. So let's see, we had a few questions about, the accident itself and, the search and recovery mission, and the fact that the Navy did hear, a bang, on their listening devices that they have out on the ocean. So there's some questions as to why such a huge search and recovery effort was undertaken when the Navy did hear something and let the officials know that something had been heard. But, do you have any opinions on that
Or insights.
or insights?
Oh.
Yep, Tony's going to mute on us.
yeah, sorry. Hi. It's a little speculative. We don't know what the Navy heard. We all suspected very early on when the sub went missing that if there had been an implosion, we were pretty sure the Navy heard it. And that came to be true. The Navy has an extensive listening network, especially in that area of the Atlantic,
Mhm.
and always has for a long time.
Yeah. Read silent
but-
war, right?
But hearing an acoustic anomaly, even a loud bang, doesn't necessarily tell them for sure the sub is lost. And we've got to give, it's the code of the sea. You give best effort to recover.
Yeah.
Until you know. And
Yeah.
it was no small coincidence that the ROV that went out to the site went straight down on top of that wreck. They knew where it was. The Navy told them where they heard the anomaly and where it was. It can take a long time to find things on the bottom of the ocean that deep. And the fact they found it as quickly as they did tells you, okay, the Navy did know precisely where it was, but you just don't know the extent. You hope it's not. You probably know that it was, but you still gotta, it's the code of the ocean. You look for survivors.
Right. I do agree with that, and even when you do, the ocean is an amazing transmitter of sounds and noise. And even back to the days when the Thresher naval submarine was lost, the way that they located that was with the help of John Craven and his calculations as to where that noise, where that sound came from. And that's how they get on that.
And another, to a lesser extent, arguable, but to put it this way, but it was a good search and rescue exercise in the sense that the Coast Guard has approached us here, I believe, too, wanting to kind of talk more about this because something like this hasn't happened in a long time.
Right.
So there was a little bit of what do we do now going on internationally. And during the 70s in the heyday of the oil fields using manned submersibles, there was a little kind of better responsibility, capabilities. And it, in some ways, search and rescue has become complacent because we haven't had any major incident in 50 years. So I wouldn't even be surprised in some ways, somewhere in the government, someone said, well, it's not a bad exercise, even if the outcome is going to be
Grim.
we know it's going to be.
Yeah, it's true.
Yes, there's cost, but there's no answer there.
Yeah. And in this case, some people were asking like, well, who's paying for all of this, and it ends up, it was kind of interesting because some people thought, well, the Canadian Coast Guard should have run point on it because the ship left from a Canadian dock and others, but it kind of got like punted over to the US Coast Guard because they have more of a, high seas capacity in that area. And the Navy came in helping a little bit, giving their 2 cents worth. So it does become kind of a, taxpayer cost because at the end of the day, an unclassed submersible operation cannot be insured in any way, shape, or form. It'll never be touched. So
in the end, after the inquiry is done, they may find OceanGate was at fault, and they may find that they should be liable for the cost of the SNR. Whether or not they'll have any funds left at that point to pay back, probably not. But that's my guess is where it's probably going to go.
Yeah, and so it's just it's frustrating, and you feel such deep empathy for the the families that were impacted in this whole incident. But there are no good legal solutions really. This company would probably dissolve, and there won't be any insurance, because it's another reason we class is so that an operation can be correctly insured and there are safeguards in place.
Well, there's a good reason why the oil and gas industry and other underwater operations for inspection or salvage have shifted over to remotely operated vehicles for the most part, in favor of either saturation deep diving operations or using manned submersibles because of the liability involved. It's one thing to lose a big machine, there's finite cost with that, but when you lose lives, it's just incalculable in terms of you can't compensate sufficiently. But think about it, Tony, and your thoughts on this, and Liz as well. For industry, you have pretty well defined jobs that need to be done. Pretty relatively straightforward in terms of tasks that need to be performed, whether you're laying pipelines or inspecting equipment, or like the Aloha station out in Hawaii, there are specific assignments. But if you're a scientist or an explorer or just somebody who wants to observe the nature of the ocean, cameras can do a pretty good job. And I look at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, MBARI. They've been deploying a big ROV out there repeatedly and making some incredible discoveries, or the Falcor operations now out in the ocean using a deep ROV.
And there are Lulukai over in Hawaii out at the CCZ.
That's right. And going out to the Clarion-Clipperton zone to look at deep sea mining in 6,000 meters of water. And so the question is, do we really need to send us humans down there? I know what my answer is, but your perspective on this as an engineer, as a witness, Liz?
Well, you and I have worked together a long time, so I think we share views on this. There are your verticals, and every tool for the job. AUVs are phenomenal at doing large repetitive area tasks, mapping, things like that. Not so good at zoning in on something dynamic, fish moving or something like that. They just can't keep up. ROVs have gotten better, in the early days when oil and gas were using manned submersibles extensively. The technology wasn't available to run ROVs at 6,500 meters. They didn't have the ability to push data and video that far and back.
And power.
So manned was required. That was the only way to do the work down there. And then as the ROVs got more capable, and then were designed to be capable of doing those repetitious, very risky, very deep jobs, they filled in. And so oil and gas walked away from manned pretty much. I think you have the strongest ability to tell us why. I mean, we've all been down in subs, all of us, the three of us here have, and we just know that there is something to the human eye and the human presence that you see and feel that is really kind of inexplicable, hard to convey, but an ROV doesn't catch it. It'll just miss that little thing. And it's just my thing I always fall back on. What's the first thing happened when they discovered the Titanic? Everyone jumped in the submarine, no matter what their opinions were about submarines or ROVs. Everyone jumped in the submarine, went down there and looked.
Yeah, that's exactly.
It's so many of us, it's our human nature.
It is.
It really does matter.
Yeah, it's been famously said repeatedly that you can't surprise a robot, right? And it is really that element of wonder and just that basic exploration, the curiosity that we all have. You want to get your own eyes on it and just be fundamentally changed.
Kathy Sullivan says that, well, in comparing, do you have to have astronauts up in the sky? Why not just send the mechanical
probe.
messengers and observers? And there is a role clearly for satellites that stay up there constantly gathering information, but they can't tell you why they want to go, says Kathy. They have no sense of humor. That's a key factor. Humans have the experience, judgment, the ability to follow a hunch that you can't build in to a machine, a lifetime of experience that whether it's a scientist or an engineer or the openness of asking questions that a kid might bring, that you have fresh minds, fresh eyes. The experience counts, but just the ability to not know what to expect and be able to see with what a camera cannot see.
It's very true. I mean, I remember we did the expedition with the Pisces submersibles over in Hawaii, and you went down in the sub with I guess one of the fish biologists, and then one of these kids, was a inner city youth kid, and he was horribly seasick on the boat, and he was kind of like, oh, I'm going to go in the sub with Sylvia, and he went down with you guys and was able to watch the Hawaiian stingray just kind of sitting there on the bottom, and then as the little fish were attracted in by the lights, the stingray would kind of rise up, and the fish would swim into the cave and get eaten, right? So there was no cave, but it was this the stingray kind of making a nice little
simulating
a cave, these little fish. And the kid was like just so excited to watch this, but even more excited was the fish biologist, who had been down on a lot of dives before, but he'd never really taken the time to observe that behavior in that way, and realized that it was a whole new behavior for this stingray species. So just bringing that interaction.
The robot would not know that either.
No, the robot would be like, record, and even in post-processing, you'd miss that kind of dynamic interaction that just went on in that moment of time that changed everyone on the whole trip. So it really is that ability to just have that gift of time below the surface and be able to observe with much more computational power in our brains than in an Xbox controller.
But it's more than facts and figures. I mean, more than just the evidence. It's the why. It's that some would say it's ineffable, but it's more than that. There is a difference between sending a camera and sending a human. It's transformative.
It truly is. And I think that we just really need to do, keep it going, have all the tools in the box when we go to sea. To Tony's point, the AUV is a wonderful tool for, doing that, mowing the lawn back and forth, the mapping, helping us figure out, like, what is the terrain likely to be? Are there, some hazards we need to be thinking about as we go down and dive? We do see a lot of things like, derelict fishing gear and so forth that are a hazard to, any kind of underwater technology. But, if a submersible were to become entangled, it's one of the reasons that, again, one of the things that question came up here about why didn't the Titan have any, kind of backup on the deck with it, right?
Question.
And Tony, maybe you can speak a little bit to the need for redundancy, and why when we build systems that we typically are building a pair of subs or a sub and an ROV together.
Yeah. And that's been, again, classing agency kind of requires you to outline a self-help plan. What are your contingencies in case of entanglement or stuck on bottom situations? And they are much more lenient when you tell them, well, we're going to have an ROV on site at all times ready to launch, or it's a 2-sub system, and the other sub will serve as the support in case something happens with the other one. So, it is a cost to the operator, no doubt, but it is just logical insurance when you're dealing with an ocean that is tempestuous, unpredictable. You don't know when you're going to dive down and run into a cut-free net that's been adrift, and get yourself entrained. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. So, yeah, that's been our philosophy, is always to have an active self-help plan that does not require outside help, possibly 3 days or more of activation to get on site. But that is, that becomes a second layer of something you can rely on, that there are assets in the world that can come help you if, the ones you have on site can't get it done.
The mirror subs in Russia,
Yeah.
there were 2 of them. They often dived in pairs. The Pisces subs at the University of Hawaii did not always dive in pairs, but they were available to do that. And when they did dive in pairs, there was a distinct advantage of one sub notifying the other when there was something cool to come see, one lighting the system so that great images could be taken. The Johnson Sea Lynx started out in the same way back in the late 60s. The reason there were 2, so that they could be like buddy diving submarines on occasion. I had the pleasure of actually being with Ed Link himself in one of the 2 Johnson Sea Lynx, and the dialogue back and forth between the subs is sometimes just really instructive. And the whole business of communication back to the surface, having those on the surface able to regularly have voice communication, it's tricky business. I mean, whales do it naturally, communicating over long distances, because sound in the water does transmit over amazingly long distances. But why is it taking so long, Tony, for voice communication to be resolved, for also getting video back through water? We send radio signals over, well, from Earth to the moon, but what needs to be done to have this breakthrough for communication?
Well, unless there's some fundamental physics that we discover, water is a tough medium to communicate through. It's 1,000 times denser than air. It's an incompressible fluid versus a compressible. So there's a lot of differences on how sound and or radio waves travel in the ocean. The barriers we run into, thermoclines, warm or cold temperature difference as you're going down, creates a literal surface that sound waves echo off of.
And there's stuff called fish.
Yeah. And so, things are the conventional UWTs that are used out there work, but they can be a little tricky and have problems. We use different frequencies for those reasons, different power settings. All of it could be very easily solved by just turning up the power. You put 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 watts into a communication system, and you'll get the message through. But what are we going to do to the animals around you?
Exactly.
Whales generate some incredible amounts of noise, but we were also finding we're doing a lot of damage to them with our sonars. So, walking that line, especially for research and science, we got to be careful. As far as I know, and there was a question about what were they using on Titan. They were using an underwater, through water acoustic modem versus a UWT, which UWT basically takes our sound waves, changes it to a different frequency of transmission. Usually I think 2,700 kilohertz or 1,500 kilohertz, 50,000 kilohertz, 27,000 kilohertz. There are usually a couple frequencies you can select. And then there's a transducer on the submersible itself that then vibrates at that frequency, sends it up through the water. You can hear it if you're in the water as a diver. I find it very grating and irritating to hear, especially the 10,000 kilohertz frequency one, because it's in our audio range and it's nails on a chalkboard, just
Yeah, it's
in the
terrible.
water. 27 is above our hearing, but what's it doing to the other animals? How are they feeling about that? Probably not great. And I believe they were using a modem that was operating probably on those similar frequencies, but they didn't have a secondary system for direct local comms, UWT. So, that's what they were using. But again, at those depths, it's tough. It's a hard problem, because there are a lot of factors that interfere, short of just pumping a lot of power into it. And again, on a sub, you have submersible, you have finite amount of power. So how much batteries do you carry to run that system? How much damage you do by running one at high power?
Exactly.
It's a very complex problem, and it's not something I've seen any jumps in physics or understanding that's going to suddenly we're like, oh, it's really easy to transmit through water.
Yeah, it's just not.
Light, lasers, things like that get absorbed very quickly. So
Yeah.
again, incredible amount of power, but that amount of power, you start pumping it in there, you're just going to boil the water and have other problems with that. So
Yeah, exactly. So we have a few minutes left, and I want to take a few of the live questions that have come in. Stephanie is asking us, I heard there's a push to stop people from visiting the Titanic. Is it important for scientists to keep studying this site? Stockton Rush used the science angle to promote these trips. Where do we draw the line? So, I mean, Titanic, to me, it's a marine grave. It's a wrecked ship. I think there's a lot more interesting things to be seen out in the ocean than our various pieces of wreckage here and there. What do you think?
Well, there are some kinds of information that can be gathered from a scientific standpoint, evaluating change over time, the age of organisms. We know exactly when the Titanic went down, even to the minute. So concerning the creatures that have set up housekeeping, they have a minimum age. You don't know exactly how long they've been there, but for sponges and other living creatures that settle down, it's a long-term ecological study, I suppose, that has a certain value. The deterioration of the materials also, how long, we know exactly how long they've been exposed at that depth and that temperature. So it's an unintended experiment in terms of understanding the lifetime of some of the materials involved. There's just a certain attraction because of the notoriety of that particular shipwreck, and it's like a magnet that people want to see for themselves, just as those who originally discovered the Titanic, the pictures were great, but they wanted to go. They wanted to see it.
They wanted to see it.
That's ineffable. That's something you can't quite quantify or explain, but it's enough to inspire people to pay $250,000 for the ability to go down and experience what it is like to be at that site. So the scientific and engineering values, you can quantify the interest people have in wanting to go is without limit.
Yeah, it's kind of a fascination. And Caroline asks, why do you think so much more government money is spent going up in the air versus exploring the ocean?
The great mystery of the sea.
Yeah. Well, you always talk about the disparity between the National Marine Fisheries budget and the National Marine Sanctuaries budget.
Right.
It's
order of magnitude.
Right. So what is it? What is it typically running? It's
under $100 million to really protect our network of national marine sanctuaries, closer to $1 billion to support the marketing, the finding, catching, and marketing of ocean wildlife, the fish in the sea. So there's just a different attitude about things that we value. Value in terms of money, value in terms of how what we think is important. We think it's important to go high in the sky, to be able to explore the heavens above. We have been neglecting this part of the universe, this part of our solar system.
70% of our planet.
No, it's 95%.
95%.
Biosphere,
Yeah.
where life occurs. So I think it's beginning to change as people do bring back information, news, the sense of excitement about the nature of the ocean. We're getting better about mapping the sea. I mean, when I was a kid, I think the amount of ocean that had been mapped was less than 1%. The amount of ocean that had been protected when I was chief scientist at NOAA was a fraction of 1%. What we now have mapped with the same degree of accuracy that is there for the moon and Mars and our terrestrial parts of the planet, we're getting pretty close to 20%. But that means that there's a lot left to do just for mapping the nature of the sea floor. It doesn't even count what the ocean itself, the part from the top to the bottom, that is dynamic. It's hard to really hold it still to understand what's in the middle. We're getting better about currents, for example, about the distribution of layers of life, and to be able to map that too, with a big shout out to Esri, the GIS genius company that is really taking big strides to mapping and showing the layers of the ocean. But as far as getting to know who lives there, we're still maybe 10% of the ocean has been seen by anybody. I mean, below where divers can go. And that's the skin of the ocean, down to, not just how deep can you hold your breath, but how deep can you go with scuba?
Yeah.
How deep can you go with rebreathers? How deep can you go now with remotely operated vehicles? How many of them are there? Tony, how many remotely operated vehicles can go to 6,000 meters presently, or to the full ocean depth?
Is there a dozen in the world? I'm not.
Not even,
I don't know the count, but it's not a large number.
Yeah. No, we've
hard to know. And many of them are tied up by the oil field industry, so we don't really know how many they have going on, but they're not being used for science. They're being used very specific task wise. In the science industry, we've got what, 3 or 4?
Yeah, well, there's the two that we've built, University of Hawaii and the other one. And then, we've got some others that we've done for the 2,000 to 4,000 meter range, just, for science and film, but there's just a few of them.
Average depth of the ocean.
Japanese have one. I think the Chinese have 1 or 2.
Yeah. So we got
Mbari.
Got a few more questions to get through. Martin is asking, it's kind of a good lead on here, is how can subs be used to visualize the need for marine protection areas and hope spots?
Oh, well, we need to have witnesses. We need to have experienced observers, scientists, and the like. But we also need to get fresh eyes, need to be able to have access to the sea. I mean, it's our planet after all. And if you don't, people ask me, what's the biggest problem facing the ocean today? Why don't people care? Why are we lagging so far behind in terms of investing in the skies above versus the depths of the sea? That was a question that we just had. If you don't know, you can't care. And the ignorance about the nature of the ocean is so vast. We've just begun to explore the ocean in ways that give us real insight. When you think that Jane Goodall spent 15 years and longer, I mean, a lifetime, getting to know one species very well. And we're still making new discoveries about the nature of chimpanzees. But she, through her observations and her long-term insights, having the ability to see from their standpoint what the world is like, changed our attitude about our fellow primates, but about life generally, to have a greater sense of empathy and sensitivity, seeing the world through their eyes. The octopus teacher, a year of studying just one single octopus, gave us incredible new insights and a different attitude about them. Most people only see fish, if they're lucky, they'll see them alive in an aquarium or maybe as a diver, but most people generally only see dead animals, fish on their plate, fish in a fish market. And it just, we don't know who they are, don't have that empathy, don't understand what they do or how their existence relates to ours. We're beginning right now in the 21st century to have a greater insight, greater empathy, greater respect for the nature of the ocean as a living system. But with respect to the big headline of our day about climate change, the emphasis still, it's so frustrating. The focus is on terrestrial systems and the atmosphere, when the reality is beginning to be brought into focus that the ocean governs climate, governs temperature, planetary chemistry. If we had no ocean, there would not be life. But what we know about the ocean is still shockingly trivial, small, as compared to what we know about the rest of the planet. So this is the moment
for exploration.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and
using man subs, woman subs, whatever it takes.
Human occupied vehicles.
Human occupied vehicles.
Yeah. So
and all the other tools as well.
Yeah, and so we got 2 more questions we'll try to get to before we run out of time. But so to what extent does tourism, like we saw with the Titan, improve the funding situation of underwater exploration and the keen interest of the public? I think it's just there to be done. You know, we have 2 submersibles under build at the moment that are going to serve that in that duality for science and tourism that are fully classed, but that will be able to. I think one of the really important things is to be able to develop those interactions between sort of, you know, ordinary citizens and scientists working together within a submersible, or, you know, scientists with a kid, musician, you know, just that mashup of people that you can expose to these ocean experiences and have them come away with a much greater understanding, which they will then talk about. And that's how you drive change.
You know, I really applaud this evolution of submersibles that are getting out there, not just for learned scientists and not just for industry, not just for military applications, but we need to get to know Earth, the ocean planet, from the inside out as well as from the top down, from the high in the sky.
Exactly. Okay, John is asking, why are we not seeing any updates about the Titan investigations? Where could we find information about the status reports or announcements?
Tony, do you have an answer?
There we go. It's kind of like, in some ways, it's like a criminal investigation. The Coast Guard's leading it. They're really not going to be talking about it until they come to the end and reach their conclusions. So because loss of life was involved, liability in loss of life, you know, we don't know how far they'll go in terms of what type of you know, was this manslaughter?
Yeah.
So it's a pretty sensitive investigation. So I really don't expect us to hear a whole lot until it's done.
I would agree with that.
Unfortunately, it's you know, I don't think having it open to the public and conjecture and everything like that would help the U.S. Coast Guard get it done properly at all.
No,
So,
it's true. You know, we've been involved in a lot of you know, recoveries where loss of life happened, and it is true. You know, you handle these things in with extraordinary sensitivity for the families, and for the accident investigation to really occur within the lanes that it needs to occur in, so that you don't have you know, kind of contaminated evidence and things like that happening. So it is an important but extensive process that goes on. So it's going to take time. It could be years before we really see a full reports come out. So
there's still a couple questions. Let's,
but we're at the top of the hour.
well,
All right, we'll
squeeze them in.
Squeeze them in, as you say, as you wish. Oh, there's one more. John is saying, we did see those leaked harbor pictures of the demob and offboarding that provided some technical insight. So it's kind of a statement, but yeah, we saw obviously the imploded remains of the submersible, but you know, there's still a lot that needs to be done to evaluate that wreckage to be able to kind of understand, you know, what the sequence of events might have been.
I think the bottom line is that accidents do sometimes happen, but we have the ways and means to make undersea exploration at least, as I would say, safer than driving cars.
Absolutely.
That's dangerous.
Yeah, getting on the freeway around here is, you know, but definitely safer than driving to the airport. So, all right, so we are at the top of the hour, and before we close today, we want to say thank you, Tony, thank you, Ocean Elders, and thank you to everyone who continues to join in and dive in with us. We really are grateful to all of you, and water connects us all. We're going to be back probably in October, and we're going to be talking about saving sharks.
Oh, right. Oh,
Sharktober, yes.
Yay.
Yeah. And until then, take care of the ocean as if your life depends on it. Because
it does.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again next time. Thank you again, Tony. Bye for now.